Time to throw out Grandma's garbage. The words hit me first. Before the image, before the upbeat, vapid pop song bleeding from her phone. The words land like stones in the quiet of the living room, a space I no longer recognize as my own. It is a showroom of beige and white, sterile and cold, smelling faintly of lemon-scented chemicals and Jessica's expensive perfume. My eyes find her, Jessica, 32, a vision of manufactured perfection in her matching activewear, smiling a brilliant, toothy smile into the camera she holds aloft like a scepter. "Hey guys," she chirps, her voice a pitch too high, too bright. "Welcome back to my Minimalist Monday." Today, we are tackling something so many of you have asked me about. We're tackling toxic ancestral clutter. Her camera, and the thousands of unseen eyes behind it, pans away from her flawless face. It sweeps across the pristine white walls, the single orchid on the glass coffee table, and then it lands. It lands on the corner of the room, on the dusty cardboard box that holds the last remnants of me, of my family, of a life lived before I became a ghost in my own home. My breath catches. A small, silent thing. I am standing in the arched doorway that leads to the hall, half hidden in the shadows, where I usually am. A piece of furniture they forgot to put in storage. Inside that box is a cracked, leather-bound book, its spine worn smooth by my grandfather's hands. There is a tarnished silver music box, small and heavy, that my mother would wind for me on nights when thunder shook the house. There is a bundle of yellowed letters, tied with a brittle piece of twine, the paper still smelling of my grandmother's lavender sachets. My history. My heart. Jessica's voice pulls me from the memory, dripping with a condescending pity that is somehow worse than outright cruelty. "My sweet stepmother-in-law, Melanie," she says, her lips forming a perfect sympathetic pout for her audience. She just can't seem to let go of the past. But you guys know, new energy can't flow into a space that's filled with this. She crouches, the movement fluid and athletic, a stark contrast to the ache in my own joints. Her perfectly manicured fingers, nails painted a pale, inoffensive pink, reach into the box. They bypass the book, the letters. They wrap around the porcelain doll my father won for me at a county fair the summer I turned 7. Its calico dress is faded, and one of its glassy blue eyes is missing, lost decades ago in a childhood accident. She holds it up to the phone's lens. "I mean, look at this," she says, a little laugh bubbling in her throat. "It's creepy. Time to throw out Grandma's garbage." She repeats the phrase, savouring it. It literally stinks up my aesthetic. The word hangs in the air. Aesthetic. A word that means everything in her world and nothing in mine. The box doesn't stink. It smells of old paper and cedar and time. It smells of home. This house, her house, only smells of clean. A clean so total it erases everything that came before it. It erases me. I feel a tremor start in my hands. A faint vibration of a rage so old and so deeply buried I'd forgotten it was there. My feet, clad in the soft, worn slippers David bought me for Christmas 3 years ago, feel nailed to the floorboards. I need to speak. I need to make a sound to prove I am still here, that the contents of that box are not garbage, that they are the very threads of a story she is about to tear apart. My mouth is dry, my throat tight. The pop song on her phone swells. a synthetic beat pulsing through the room. I watch as she places the doll back in the box, not with care, but with a dismissive drop. The tiny thud it makes against the other items is a sound only I can hear, a sound of profound violation. She smiles again, that bright, empty smile. Okay, besties, time for the cleanse, wish me luck. I take a step forward, the floorboard creaks, a sound of protest in the hollow silence of her performance. For the first time, I am moving toward the light. My shadow stretches out before me, long and thin, falling over the edge of the pristine white rug. I step out of the doorway, into the bright, unforgiving light of the living room, where my life is being curated for public consumption. My hands are trembling, not just with rage now, but with a desperate, pleading fear. Jessica, please. My voice is a stranger to me, thin, raspy, like a dusty hinge. It's been so long since I used it to ask for anything. Please, those are my grandmothers. They tell our family's story. My stepson, David, her husband, is standing by the kitchen island. He has been there the whole time, a silent accomplice. He's scrolling on his phone, the blue light illuminating a face I barely recognize anymore. The face of my late husband, but weaker, the lines of character blurred into a soft, pliant complacency. He doesn't look up. His thumb continues its relentless, rhythmic swipe across the glass screen. He is pointedly, deliberately avoiding my gaze. He's an expert at it. Jessica doesn't even grant me the courtesy of looking at me. Her eyes remain fixed on her own reflection in the phone's screen. She is speaking not to me, but through me, to her audience of strangers. See, she says, her voice taking on the patient, instructive tone of a lifestyle guru. This is exactly what I'm talking about. This is the emotional attachment we have to break to truly be free. She lets out a sharp, brittle laugh, a sound like breaking glass. It's a performance of empathy, but there is a glint of triumph in her eyes. My pain is her content. My humiliation is her engagement. She finally turns her head slightly, her gaze flicking over me as if I were a piece of furniture she'd forgotten was there. It's just hoarder trash, Mel, she says, her voice softening into a counterfeit gentleness that is more insulting than a scream. Let it go, for your own good. Before I can find the words to protest again, before I can explain that the leather book holds the only remaining photograph of my great-grandparents, or that the music box plays a lullaby unique to our family, a song that has been sung to 6 generations of Calloway children, she acts. She hoists the box, her toned arms, sculpted in expensive gems, strain theatrically. She lets out a small performative grunt for the camera, a testament to the heavy burden she is lifting. The box is not heavy. It is filled with paper and memories and hollow things. Its weight is not in pounds, but in years, a weight she cannot begin to comprehend. She turns and walks toward the front door, her movements swift and decisive. I am frozen, a statue of silent protest. I watch her carry my entire history across the polished hardwood floors. Each step is a hammer blow to my chest. David still hasn't moved. The only sound is the click of Jessica's heels and the faint tinny beat of the pop song still playing from her phone. She pulls open the heavy front door, letting in a slice of the bright, indifferent afternoon. With a final, decisive movement, she carries my life out onto the porch and down the short steps. I hear the dull, plastic scrape as she dumps the entire box. My grandmother's letters, my mother's music box, my father's gift, beside the large municipal trash bins waiting on the curb. A final, resounding thud as it settles among the bags of coffee grounds and discarded packaging from her online shopping. Garbage collection is tomorrow morning. Before the sun is fully up, it will all be gone, crushed, compacted, erased. The door closes, shutting out the world. The lock clicks into place, a sound of finality. Jessica leans against the closed door, exhaling a dramatic sigh of relief for her phone. Done, she says, smiling.
It feels so much lighter in here already, doesn't it?
David finally looks up from his phone. His face is unreadable for a moment, and in that split second, a desperate, foolish hope flares in my chest. A hope that he will see the devastation in my eyes, that some flicker of the boy I helped raise, the boy whose scraped knees I bandaged, is still in there. The hope dies as quickly as it came. He offers me a weak, apologetic shrug, the gesture of a man who has long since chosen the path of least resistance. "She's right, Mel," he says, his voice quiet, devoid of malice, but full of something worse, indifference. "We need the space." And that's it. A century of a family's existence, of their joys and sorrows, their triumphs and their secrets, is weighed against the desire for more empty space in a house that is already a vacuum. And the space wins. I stand there, in the sudden, ringing silence of the living room, the pop music having finally ended. I don't say another word. There are no words left. There is only the image, burned into my mind, of a cardboard box sitting on a curb, waiting to be forgotten. The sun is beginning to set, casting long, cold shadows across the manicured lawn. And for the first time in my 68 years, I feel completely and utterly alone. The ghost in the house has finally been exorcised to them, to this town, to the son I helped raise. I am a ghost in beige cardigans. My name is Melanie Thorne. That is the name on the mail that arrives for me. The name David uses when he bothers to introduce me. A name I took in hope and love 40 years ago. It is a good name, an honourable name. It was my husband Arthur's name. But it is not my only name. It is not the name that flows in my blood, the name that is written on the very bedrock of this valley. Before Thorne, I was a Calloway, and that is a name this town has spent over a century trying to bury. They think my story began the day I married Arthur Thorne, a kind, widowed architect with a young son and a sad, empty house. They see me as the quiet woman who filled that house with the smell of baked bread and the sound of soft footsteps, the woman who raised his boy as her own, who held his hand through the long illness that finally took him, and who then faded gracefully into the background of her stepson's shiny new life. They are not entirely wrong. I did all of those things. I loved Arthur with a depth that stills my breath even now. He was my sanctuary. He never asked about the shadows in my eyes, but I know he saw them. He would just take my hand, his thumb tracing circles on my palm, and he would say, "You're safe here, Mel. You're home." For decades, I almost believed him. I wanted to believe him. I poured myself into being Mrs. Thorne, into being David's mother in all but blood. I packed his school lunches. I cheered the loudest at his baseball games. I helped him with his homework at the big oak table in the kitchen, the same table where Jessica now edits her videos. I taught him how to be kind, how to be honest, how to look a person in the eye. I see so little of that boy in the man who stood by and let his wife call my history toxic junk. When Arthur got sick, my world shrank to the four walls of his bedroom. I learned the schedules of his medications, the language of his pained sighs, the art of making him comfortable when comfort was all I had left to give. I promised him, in those last whispered conversations under the dim glow of a bedside lamp, that I would always look out for David. I would always be here. It was a promise I intended to keep, a penance for a life I had to keep hidden. I thought that by being the perfect wife, the perfect mother, I could somehow balance the scales, that my quiet service could be a life raft in the turbulent waters of my ancestry. I chose silence. I chose love. I chose to forget the debt I carried. But the Callaways were here before the first surveyor's stake was hammered into our soil. We were here before the name Havenwood was a slick marketing concept for a luxury lifestyle. Before the manicured lawns and the million-dollar modern farmhouses with their floor-to-ceiling windows that look out on a valley they think they own. We didn't own the valley, not in the way they understand ownership. We were a part of it. The wind in the tall pines whispered our name. The cold, clear water of the river that now cuts through their golf course was our lifeblood. Our hands knew the feel of this earth, its scent after a rain, its bounty, its moods. We were the valley, and the valley was us. Then they came, the founding families, the Prescotts, the Brodys, the Wainwrights, Jessica's people. They arrived not with guns and declarations of war, but with something far more insidious. Money, lawyers, and a sanctimonious belief in their own manifest destiny. They called it progress. They called it opportunity. My great-grandfather called it theft. They used contracts with clauses no plain-speaking farmer could understand to steal our water rights, leaving our fields to wither. They used their influence in the newly formed county to rezone our ancestral lands for public use, only to buy them back for pennies on the dollar through shell corporations. And when legal manoeuvring wasn't enough, there were accidents. A barn fire on a moonless night ruled an act of God. A man, my great-uncle, who went into the woods to hunt and was never seen again, ruled a tragic disappearance. The items in that box Jessica so casually desecrated were not sentimental trinkets. They were a record, a reckoning. That heavy leather-bound book she mocked for its smell of old people, that was my great-grandfather's ledger, with his meticulous hand-drawn maps of the original water flow from the Callaway Springs, proof that the town's entire water supply was built on a lie. The tarnished silver locket with the faded photograph inside. That was the face of the man who disappeared in the woods. A man whose sworn testimony would have exposed the land fraud. The stack of letters, tied with a faded silk ribbon that Jessica called hoarder clutter. They were from a terrified woman in town to my grandmother, detailing the threats her husband received from Jessica's great-great-grandfather before his accidental death at the new lumber mill. Every object was a key, a testament to a crime, a gravestone for a piece of our stolen history, passed down from mother to daughter, a silent, sacred duty. My life has been a performance of meekness, a long, patient play, waiting for the final act. I remember the day the weight of that duty was formally passed to me. The world outside was bright with the promise of summer, but inside my grandmother's house, the air was thick with the scent of chamomile and old wood. I was 16, all long limbs and foolish dreams of a life far from Havenwood. A life where my name was just a name. My grandmother, Elspeth Callaway, sat in her armchair by the window, the afternoon light catching the silver in her braided hair. Her hands, gnarled and twisted by arthritis into the shape of ancient tree roots, rested in her lap. She called me over, her voice a dry, rustling whisper, like leaves skittering across pavement. "Melanie," she said, her eyes, still a startling clear blue, locking onto mine. They held the weight of generations. Come here. I knelt by her chair, and she lifted one of her frail hands. In her palm lay a small, tarnished silver music box. It was a simple thing, etched with vines and a single sleeping bird. It was the one I just saw half buried in David's flower bed, discarded like a piece of trash. She pressed it into my hand. Her skin was as thin and dry as parchment. "This is not a toy, child," she whispered, her grip surprisingly strong.
This is a promise.
She took a deep, shuddering breath. "They will build their perfect little town on our bones and our silence. They will pave our memories and call it a road. They will drink our water and forget the name of the spring. They will grow fat and happy on the land they stole, and they will teach their children that they earned it, that it was their destiny. They will forget us. It is your job," she said, her voice gaining a steely edge that sent a shiver down my young spine. "To never, ever forget." She told me about the box of evidence, where it was hidden, what each item meant. She told me it was my charge to protect it, to keep the silence, to live amongst them, to smile and be a good neighbour, and to watch. "But what am I watching for?" I asked, my own voice a confused squeak. Her eyes drifted to the window, looking out over the town that sprawled across what was once our orchards. "You are waiting for the sign of ultimate disrespect," she said, her voice dropping again to that conspiratorial whisper. "They have taken our land, our water, our history. The only thing we have left is the memory of that injustice. There will come a day when they will grow so arrogant, so comfortable in their lies, that they will try to take that too. They will try to erase the very memory of the crime. They will try to throw our story away like it is nothing more than garbage. When they desecrate the proof of their sins, when they try to erase us completely, that is the sign. That is when you are released from your promise of silence. That is when you make them pay the debt." For 52 years, I have carried those words. For 52 years, I have been the keeper of the debt. I guarded the box, moved it from house to house, a quiet, ticking bomb in my life. I had hoped the day would never come. I had hoped that my marriage to Arthur, my love for David, the simple, good life I had built, was enough. I had let myself believe the debt could be forgiven, if not forgotten. But yesterday, watching Jessica hold up my family's legacy for the cheap amusement of strangers, calling our pain clutter and our proof junk, I heard my grandmother's voice as clearly as if she were standing right beside me. This was it. The gleeful, public broadcasted attempt to erase us completely. This was the sign of ultimate disrespect. She didn't just throw away a box of old things. She threw away the Calloway name, the Calloway story, and in doing so, she unwittingly unlocked the cage I have lived in my entire life. The performance is over. The debt is due, and they have no idea that the quiet, forgettable old woman in the guest room is the one who has come to collect. The silence in the days that followed was different. It was no longer the hollow silence of neglect, but a dense, smug silence. It was the quiet of a battle won, a territory claimed. I would sit in the small, worn armchair in the corner of the living room, the one they'd unofficially designated as mine, and listen to the house breathe around me. It breathed with Jessica's expensive, cloying vanilla and sandalwood candles, a scent meant to purify and erase. It was erasing every trace of my late husband, Richard. It was erasing me. I first heard about the video's success not by seeing it, but by overhearing Jessica in the kitchen, her voice a high, triumphant trill on the phone. "Oh my God, Brenda, you saw it? I was so nervous to post it, you know? It's such a sensitive topic, but the response has been, honestly, overwhelming." A pause, filled with the soft clinking of her acrylic nails against her phone screen. "I know. Brave is the word everyone keeps using. It's not about being mean, it's about establishing healthy boundaries. That's what I told David. We can't enable hoarding behavior. It's not good for her, and it's certainly not a healthy environment for Leo." Leo, their 5-year-old son. He was a whirlwind of noise and bright primary-coloured toys, and he was often used as a shield for their cruelty. "We have to keep the downstairs tidy for Leo. We can't have dusty old things around. Leo has allergies. Melanie, could you please not leave your book on the coffee table? Leo might rip the pages." My grandson, weaponized against me. I heard her read a comment aloud, her voice dripping with false humility. "Jessica, you're an inspiration. I've been trying to have this exact conversation with my mother-in-law for years, and you've given me the courage. See, it's helping people, Bren. It's starting a conversation." The conversation it started in Havenwood was a quiet, insidious one. It happened in whispers over coffee at the daily grind and in the checkout line at the supermarket. I discovered the full extent of it a few days later, when our supply of milk ran low. Jessica made a great show of being too busy with a brand collaboration to go, and David had an early meeting. The task, as always, fell to me. Walking into the Havenwood market was like stepping onto a stage under a harsh, unwelcome spotlight. The familiar chime of the bell over the door sounded like an alarm announcing my arrival. Carol Ann, who'd been ringing up my groceries for 20 years, whose wedding I'd attended, gave me a tight, fleeting smile that didn't reach her eyes. Her usual, "How are you today, Mel?" was replaced with a brisk, "Just this for you?" Her gaze flickered away from mine, down to the carton of milk in my hand, as if it were an object of immense fascination. I moved toward the produce section, my cart's wobbly wheels suddenly seeming impossibly loud in the hushed store. I saw Mrs. Gable, from 2 streets over, examining avocados. Our eyes met for a fraction of a second. In that instant, I saw it all. The pity, the morbid curiosity, the faint hint of superiority. She gave a curt, jerky nod and turned her back to me, becoming intensely focused on a pile of lemons. Before the video, she would have rushed over, launching into a long story about her hydrangeas or her sciatica. Now, I was a contagion, a ghost haunting the aisles. Everywhere I looked, it was the same. Averted eyes, stiff smiles. People I had known my whole life suddenly finding the ceiling tiles or the scuff on their shoes utterly captivating. They weren't being overtly cruel, it was worse. It was a soft, suffocating blanket of social rejection, woven from pity and second-hand shame. I was no longer Melanie Thorne, Richard's widow, a woman who'd baked cakes for the town bake sale and volunteered at the library. I was the crazy old hoarder lady from the Facebook video. A cautionary tale. The human equivalent of the dusty, toxic box Jessica had so heroically discarded. Back in the car, I gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles white. The carton of milk sat on the passenger seat, cold and indifferent. For the first time, the sheer, calculated brilliance of Jessica's attack hit me. She hadn't just thrown away my family's history, she had stripped me of my public identity, my place in the community I'd called home for 40 years. She had isolated me, preemptively discredited me. Who would listen to the crazy old hoarder lady? Who would believe her over the bright, beautiful, and brave young influencer who was only trying to set healthy boundaries? The days that followed fell into a grim, repetitive pattern. Each one was a small, sharp cut. My meals, which had long been a point of quiet contention, became an exercise in humiliation. While David, Jessica, and Leo ate in the dining room, the sound of their laughter and silverware a painful symphony, a plate would be left for me on the kitchen counter, usually leftovers, often cold. I ate standing up, or perched on a hard wooden stool, using the plastic cup and plate that had been designated as mine, so they wouldn't get mixed up with Leo's things. Overfor, said Ra. One evening, Jessica was teaching Leo his colours at the dining table, her voice loud and performative. "And what colour is this, sweetie?" "It's blue, like the sky. And this is red, like a fire truck. And this is grey." She held up a grey crayon, and I felt her eyes on me, though I was facing the kitchen sink. "Grey is the colour of old things, honey, like dusty old rocks and sad rainy days. We don't like grey very much, do we? We like bright, happy colours." David just sat there, shoveling food into his mouth, his gaze fixed on his plate. My son-in-law, Richard's son. He had his father's eyes, but none of his father's spine. Richard would have never stood for this. He would have brought me a proper chair, a ceramic plate. He would have looked his son in the eye and asked him what in God's name he thought he was doing. But Richard was gone, and his son was a hollow man, a puppet dancing on his wife's strings. The television in the living room was now permanently locked with a parental code. "For Leo," Jessica had said with a bright, empty smile. "He's getting too much screen time," but I knew. It was one more small comfort. One more window to the world, sealed shut. My world had shrunk to the four walls of my small bedroom and the humiliating landscape of the kitchen. It was in this atmosphere, thick with my own silent desperation, that Jessica chose to make her final move. It was a Tuesday morning. The air was still and heavy, promising a hot afternoon. I was in my chair reading a book, the same one I'd been trying to read for a week, my mind unable to focus on the words. She glided into the room, a predator moving with unnerving grace. David followed a few paces behind her, his hands shoved in his pockets, his shoulders hunched. He wouldn't look at me. Jessica, however, met my gaze directly. Her smile was a masterpiece of practiced sympathy. "Melanie," she began, her voice a low, syrupy coo. She sat on the edge of the sofa opposite me, leaning forward conspiratorially, as if we were sharing a secret. She slid a glossy, trifold brochure across the coffee table, the table I was not allowed to place things on. I looked down at it. The cover showed a vibrant, manicured lawn, with a group of silver-haired seniors laughing, frozen in a moment of forced joy. The words Evergreen Meadows Assisted Living were printed in a soft, elegant cursive. "David and I have been talking," Jessica continued, her voice radiating a nauseating concern. "And, well, we're so worried about you, Mel. We really are." I looked from her face to David's. He was now staring intently at a spot on the carpet, rocking back and forth slightly on his heels. A puppet. A miserable, guilty puppet. "We feel that this house, it's just so big," Jessica said, gesturing vaguely at the room. "And with Leo running around, it's a lot to manage. We think a community with professional support would be best for you. A place where you can be with people your own age. They have activities, bingo, and there's a nurse on site 24/7. My heart, which I thought had been beaten into a numb, silent lump, began to pound against my ribs. I said nothing. My silence had become my only shield, my only defense. I would not give them the satisfaction of my tears or my anger. David finally spoke, his voice raspy, as if he hadn't used it in days. It's for your own good, Mel. He still wouldn't look at me. His eyes were fixed on the brochure, as if it held the answers to the universe. This house just isn't equipped for, you know. For, you know. The words hung in the air. A euphemism for my age, for my grief, for my very existence, which had become an inconvenience. It wasn't a suggestion. It wasn't a discussion. It was an eviction notice, wrapped in the language of care, gift-wrapped in condescension. I slowly reached out and picked up the brochure. The paper was smooth and cool against my trembling fingers. I opened it. Pictures of smiling, well-dressed elderly people stared back at me. A woman painting watercolours. A man playing chess. A group doing chair yoga. It was a fantasy, a carefully curated lie, designed to soothe the consciences of children abandoning their parents. The facility is beautiful, Jessica purred, sensing a victory. We can schedule a tour for you on Thursday. They have a room available. A lovely little private suite with a window overlooking the rose garden. I closed the brochure and placed it back on the table. I looked at David, forcing him to meet my eyes for a moment. I saw a flicker of the boy he used to be, the boy who would run to me with a scraped knee, the boy his father had loved so fiercely. It was gone, in an instant, replaced by a mask of weary resolve. He was a stranger. We think it's best if you're settled in by the end of next week, Jessica said, her voice becoming more businesslike, the syrupy sweetness dissolving to reveal the hard, cold core beneath. It will give us time to rearrange things here before the big garden party. 1 week. The words echoed in the suffocating silence of the room. They had given me 1 week to dismantle the last 40 years of my life. 1 week to pack up the remnants of my existence and be shipped off to a place called Evergreen Meadows, a place where I would wait to die. Jessica stood up, smoothing down her yoga pants. I'm so glad we had this talk, she said, her smile not reaching her cold, triumphant eyes. This is a positive step for everyone, a new beginning. She and David left the room. I heard her start talking to him in the hallway, her voice returning to its normal, brisk tone, already moving on to the next item on her agenda. I'll call them now and confirm the tour for Thursday at 10. After that, we need to pick up the new outdoor furniture for the party. I sat there, alone, the glossy brochure lying on the table like a death sentence. The house was silent again, but the quality of the silence had changed once more. It was no longer smug. It was final. The daily small cuts had given way to a single mortal wound. They thought they had won. They thought they had erased me. But as I stared at the promise of a merciful exile, a different feeling began to stir in the frozen depths of my despair. It was cold and hard and patient. It was the Calloway in me, waking from a long, bitter sleep. The debt, I realized, was about to be called in, and the price would be far higher than they could ever imagine. The sound of the garbage truck was a death rattle. It came with the first weak rays of dawn, a mechanical beast groaning its way down our manicured street. I stood at the living room window, a ghost in my own home. My reflection a faint superimposition over the pristine lawn.
I didn't need to see the bin to know what was happening. I could feel it. The hydraulic whine, the heavy clank as the plastic container was lifted, tipped, and shaken empty. A lifetime of memories, of stories whispered through generations, of promises made in blood and ink, was being ingested by the monster. I watched it compact its meal, the grinding sound a physical violation. My family's history, my very identity, crushed and mixed with last night's salmon scraps and Jessica's empty acai bowl containers. The truck rumbled on to the next house, leaving behind an obscene silence. I felt hollowed out, scoured clean. The final erasure. For days I moved through the house like a sleepwalker, performing the small, invisible tasks that kept their perfect world running smoothly. I refilled the artisanal soap dispensers. I sorted David's expensive dress shirts for the dry cleaner. I polished the smudges off the vast glass doors that led to the garden. It was in the garden, later that week,
that my world tilted on its axis.
The sun was high and unforgiving, beating down on the ridiculously perfect rows of Jessica's prize-winning hydrangeas. She loved the hydrangeas. They were photogenic. Their lush, oversized blooms a perfect backdrop for her posts about cultivating beauty in your own backyard. My job was to keep them alive. As I aimed the fine mist of the hose at the base of a particularly vibrant blue bush, a glint of something metallic caught my eye. It was almost completely buried in the dark, rich soil of the flower bed, caked in mud. An oversight. In her theatrical, performative haste to dispose of my life, Jessica had been clumsy. My breath caught in my throat, a sharp, painful thing. My hand, holding the nozzle, began to tremble. I dropped the hose, the water pooling around my worn-out sneakers, and knelt in the damp earth. My fingers, stiff with age, dug into the soil, clawing at the object. I pulled it free. It was the little silver music box.
My grandmother's music box.
It was heavier than I remembered, solid and real in my palm. The dirt that clung to its ornate carvings felt like a desecration. My heart, which I thought had become a slow, tired drum, began to hammer against my ribs with a frantic, youthful rhythm. It was a panicked bird beating against a cage. Clutching it to my chest, I looked back at the house. The windows were blank, unseeing eyes. No one was watching. I was, as always, completely invisible. Inside my small, sparse room, I locked the door, a gesture of defiance that was purely symbolic, as they had never once tried to enter it. I carried the music box to the small basin and began to clean it with the gentle reverence of a priest tending to a holy relic. I used a soft cloth and warm water, my own faded towel. The mud washed away, revealing the intricate engravings of vines and nightingales. I worked slowly, meticulously, my focus narrowing to this one single object saved from the void.
This one survivor.
With the silver gleaming under the dim light of my bedside lamp, I set it on the small table. My fingers traced the familiar catch. I hesitated. For a moment I was terrified. What if it was just a box? What if the hope that had flared to life in the garden was just the last desperate flicker of a dying fire? I took a deep breath, the air tasting of dust and defeat, and I pried the delicate lid open. There was no tinkling melody. The mechanism was gone, or had perhaps never been there. The interior was lined with faded wine-red velvet, now worn and patchy in places, and nestled in the centre, lying on that bed of tired fabric, was not a dancing ballerina, but a tiny, tightly rolled-up piece of vellum, no bigger than my little finger, tied with a thread that had long since turned brown with age. My hands shook so badly it took me 3 tries to pick it up. The thread disintegrated at my touch. I carefully, painstakingly unrolled the small scroll on my nightstand. The vellum was brittle, almost translucent. On it, drawn in faded black ink, was a single stark symbol. It was an image that resonated in some deep, forgotten part of my soul. A symbol of eternity and destruction all at once. A serpent, its scales meticulously detailed, eating its own tail. And inside the perfect circle it formed, a single, jagged, lightning bolt. The sign of ultimate disrespect. The trigger. My grandmother's voice echoed in my memory, not a whisper, but a command across the decades. When they forget the debt, when they show you that our history is worth less than the dirt under their feet, you will know the pact will be broken, the debt will come due. The 2-mile walk to the old part of town felt like a pilgrimage. I avoided the main streets, the pristine avenues where women like Jessica drove their white SUVs from yoga class to organic markets. I took the back alleys, the cracked sidewalks that ran behind the older, humbler homes, places where the real, unmanicured life of Havenwood still persisted. My feet knew the way without my conscious guidance. They were leading me to the one place in this town that felt older than the lie it was built on. Abernathy's Antiques and Curios. The sign was hand-painted, the gold leaf peeling, the wood weathered by a century of Oregon rain. The bell above the door chimed softly, a sound from another era. The air inside was thick with the scent of beeswax, old paper, and something else. Something like time itself. The shop was a labyrinth of forgotten things. Grandfather clocks stood silent, their pendulums still. Stacks of leather-bound books leaned precariously. Porcelain dolls with cracked faces stared from dusty shelves. It was a sanctuary of the discarded, a temple of memory. Mr. Abernathy was behind the main counter, a man who seemed to have sprung from the very dust of his shop. He was stooped, his face a roadmap of wrinkles, his hands gnarled but steady. He was polishing a single silver spoon with a soft cloth, his movements slow and methodical. He looked up as I entered, his eyes a pale, watery blue. He offered a small, professional smile. "Mrs. Thorne," he said, his voice a dry rustle. "A pleasure to see you. Not often you venture this far down." I didn't return the pleasantry. The time for small talk was over. My heart was a cold, heavy stone in my chest. I walked to the worn wooden counter, my reflection wavering in its polished surface.
I placed the silver music box on the wood. The sound was soft, but it landed with the weight of a gavel. Then, with a hand that was surprisingly steady, I unrolled the small piece of vellum beside it. Mr. Abernathy's eyes flickered from my face to the box, and then to the symbol on the vellum. And then, it happened. The change. It wasn't sudden or dramatic. It was a quiet, profound shift, like a landscape changing under a passing cloud. The folksy,
Gentle shopkeeper vanished.
the stoop in his shoulders seemed to lessen, his watery blue eyes sharpened, the colour deepening, hardening into something ancient and unforgiving, like glacial ice. The hand holding the polishing cloth went still. He stared at the Ouroboros and the lightning bolt, and a long, slow breath escaped his lips. "She did it," he said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact, a verdict delivered. His eyes lifted and met mine, and in their depths I saw not a shopkeeper, but a sentinel, a guardian who had been waiting at his post for a lifetime. She broke the pact of silence, the final sign, the ultimate disrespect. He leant forward slightly, his gnarled hands resting flat on the counter. The shop, with its ticking clocks and dusty light, suddenly felt like a command center. The air crackled with a new and terrible energy. He looked directly at me, and for the first time in decades, I felt truly seen. Not as David's quiet mother, not as Jessica's inconvenient burden, but as myself, the last of my line. He wasn't looking at a frail old woman. He was looking at his commander.
"It is time, Melanie."
He said, his voice now devoid of its folksy rasp, replaced by a clear, resonant authority.
"The Callaway Trust is now active."
My first instinct, born of a lifetime of being conditioned to believe in systems, was to follow the established rules. A foolish, naive instinct, I would soon learn. The Callaway Trust might be active, but it was an entity of history and shadow. The world I now had to operate in was one of bright, fluorescent-lit offices and men who smiled while they dismissed you. My first step, Abernathy had agreed, had to be a test of the system itself. We had to prove its corruption before we could circumvent it. I went to the Havenwood Sheriff's Department the next morning. The building was new, a sterile brick and glass structure funded by the town's Civic Improvement Fund, a fund largely controlled by the founding families. It smelled of industrial cleaner and stale coffee. Sheriff Brody's office was at the back. His door was open. He was a big man, florid and fleshy, with the easy confidence of someone who has never had a door closed in his face. The Brody family had been in Havenwood for a century, their name synonymous with law and order, the law and order of the elite. His father had been sheriff before him. They were close friends with Jessica's parents. I'd seen them laughing together at last year's Founders' Day picnic, a tight, exclusive circle of power. He looked up from his computer as I stood in the doorway, and a patient, almost pitying smile spread across his face. "Well, hello there, Melanie. What can I do for you today?" He gestured to the uncomfortable-looking chair opposite his large, imposing desk. The nameplate on it read, Sheriff J. Brody. I sat, my hands clutching my purse in my lap. I'd rehearsed my words, but they felt flimsy and inadequate in this room. "Sheriff," I began, my voice steadier than I expected, "I'm here to report a theft, of a sort. Items of immense historical and personal value were disposed of without my consent. He listened, his head tilted, the smile never leaving his lips. It was the kind of smile you give a child who is telling you a long, rambling story about a monster under their bed. Patronizing, dismissive. Desistant of, he repeated, leaning back in his squeaking leather chair. The sound grated on my nerves. From your son's house, where you live? Yes, I said. My daughter-in-law, Jessica, threw them out, a box of family heirlooms. Ah, he said, the sound full of false understanding. He steepled his fingers. Jessica, yes. A real firecracker, that one, doing great things for the town's image. He paused. Look, Melanie, Ma'am. It sounds to me like a simple family squabble.
It's their house, after all.
Technically, they have the right to throw out what they want from their own property. It's not really a police matter. My blood ran cold. Sheriff, these were not just things. They were Callaway artifacts. They document the history of this valley. Some of them are priceless. At the mention of my family name, a flicker of something else crossed his face. Annoyance. He dropped the pretense of patience. Callaway, he said, his tone flat. That's ancient history, Melanie. We're in the 21st century now. We're about moving forward, progress. That's what David and Jessica are all about. He leaned forward, his bulk seeming to suck the air out of the room. His voice lowered. Are you feeling okay, Melanie? This obsession with the past. It's not healthy. You're under a lot of stress. David mentioned you've been a bit forgetful lately, confused. Maybe you should talk to someone. Dr. Evans is very discreet. It was a threat, wrapped in the language of concern. He wasn't just dismissing me. He was laying the groundwork to have me declared incompetent. He was siding with them, protecting the established order, just as his father and grandfather had done before him. The system wasn't broken. It was working exactly as it was designed to. It was a wall, and I had just walked straight into it. Thank you for your time, Sheriff, I said, my voice a hollow whisper. I stood up, my legs feeling weak. Any time, Melanie, he said, his patronizing smile returning, his victory complete. You take care of yourself now, you hear? I walked out of that station and into the bright, indifferent sunlight. The first obstacle hadn't just stood in my way, it had laughed in my face and suggested I was insane. The despair was a physical weight, pressing down on my shoulders. For a few blocks, I let it consume me. Maybe Brody was right. Maybe I was just a confused old woman, clinging to dusty relics and imagined slights. The Callaway Trust, the Pact, Abernathy's steely gaze. Perhaps it was all a fantasy my mind had concocted to escape the pathetic reality of my life. I arrived back at the house, a ship with no rudder, completely adrift. Jessica's car was gone. David was at work. The house was silent, a polished mausoleum. I went to my room and sat on the edge of my bed, the music box on the nightstand a silent accusation. My mission had failed at the first hurdle. The law, the entire structure of this town was allied against me. What could one old woman do against that? My gaze drifted around the small room, the last outpost of my existence. It was mostly filled with things my late husband Arthur had insisted I keep after we sold our own home to move in here. He was David's father, a good man caught between a past he didn't understand and a son he loved. He had died 3 years ago, his quiet presence the last buffer between me and the cold indifference of his son's new family. Most of his personal effects had been given away or stored, but a few small things remained in my room. A framed photograph of us on our wedding day, his favourite reading lamp, and a small, handsome mahogany box on the bottom shelf of the bookcase. I had never opened it. It was locked, and he had told me it just contained old business papers, tax documents and the like. Boring stuff, Mel, he'd said with a wink. No need to trouble your head with it. I had respected his privacy, but now my eyes were drawn to it. It felt different. Everything felt different. I ran my fingers over the polished wood. The lock was small, simple. I thought of Arthur, of his quiet sighs in the evenings, the way he would look out at the Havenwood Hills with a strange, melancholic expression. I thought of how he, a thorn, had always treated the Calloway name with a peculiar reverence that I never fully understood. On my dresser was a small dish where I kept loose buttons and safety pins.
I found a sturdy hairpin, a relic from a time when I used to put my hair up. My hands trembled as I inserted the pin into the small lock. I was no expert, but the lock was old. I wiggled the pin, feeling for the tumblers, my heart beginning to pound again, this time with a different rhythm, not of fear, but of forbidden discovery. After a few tense moments, I heard it, a soft, satisfying click. The lid lifted smoothly. The scent of old paper and cedar filled the air. It wasn't filled with tax documents. On top lay a single sealed envelope addressed to me in Arthur's familiar, spidery handwriting. Melanie, for if the time ever comes. My breath hitched. My hands shook as I broke the seal. Inside was a letter, several pages long. My dearest Melanie, the letter began. If you are reading this, it means I am gone, and that something has happened to make you look in this box. I pray that is not the case, but I was never a man to leave things to chance.
There are things I learned over the years, things about this town and my own family, that I never had the courage to tell you. I was a coward, my love. I was ashamed. I had to stop and breathe, my vision blurring. I read on. Arthur, my quiet, unassuming husband, had spent the last decade of his life secretly investigating the founding of Havenwood. He had used his access as a thorn to dig into old town archives, cross-referencing land deeds and private family ledgers. He had discovered the truth, or at least a significant part of it. He knew the Calloway land had been stolen. He knew the stories of fires and intimidation were not just rumours. I have been trying to make it right, he wrote. Quietly. I couldn't expose my own family, couldn't bring that shame upon David, but I could use our money, the Thorn money, to try and undo the damage. Over the last 8 years, I've been buying back the original Calloway parcels, piece by piece,
Through shell corporations and third-party buyers? The farm where the old mill stood, the land overlooking the river. It's almost all back in our name. My plan was to sign it all over to a new trust, a Calloway trust, in your name once it was complete. To give it back. A secret act of repentance. Tears were streaming down my face now, dripping onto the brittle paper. He had known. He had been fighting for me, for my family, in secret, all this time. But there was more. The last page was a warning. Be careful of the Harrison deal, he wrote, referring to Jessica's family name. David is so proud of it, this new luxury development they are planning. He doesn't know. He can't know. The land they are building on, the centerpiece of their new Havenwood, is the last and largest of the Calloway parcels I repurchased. They are building their future on the very ground I bought to give you back your past. They must have forged the deed transfers after my death,
Working with someone inside the county clerk's office. It's the only way, asterisk. And at the bottom of the box, beneath the letter, was a thick folder that contained copies of the original deeds he had acquired, the names of the shell corporations, and a business card for a law firm, not in Havenwood, in Portland. Stapled to the card was a note in Arthur's hand, asterisk, Jonathan Pike. He knew my father. He cannot be bought. He knows what to do, asterisk. I sat there in the silence of my room, the world outside ceasing to exist. This wasn't just a letter. It was a weapon. It was a map. My husband, from beyond the grave, had just handed me the key. Sheriff Brody and his corrupt system were no longer an insurmountable wall. They were just an obstacle,
a temporary one. The grief I felt for Arthur was immense, a fresh, raw wound, but it was mingled with a new and powerful fire. It was the fire of his love, and the cold, hard fury of his betrayal by his own son. The game had changed.
They thought I was a senile old woman, a relic to be discarded. They had no idea I was now armed with the truth. And the truth, I was beginning to realize, was a far more dangerous thing than a box of old memories. I walked through my own front door, but it felt like entering enemy territory. The air was still and thick with the cloying scent of Jessica's victory. She was on the sofa, scrolling through her phone, a small, self-satisfied smile playing on her lips. David was at the kitchen counter, staring into a cup of coffee as if it held the answers to the universe. He didn't look at me. The cowardice was a physical presence in the room. I let my shoulders slump, forcing a tremor into my hands as I set my purse down on the hall table. I made my steps slow, shuffling, the gait of a woman whose world had just been neatly dismantled by a county sheriff and her own family. "Melanie?" David asked, his voice strained. He still hadn't turned around. I took a slow, rattling breath.
"He was right," I said, my voice a papery whisper. "Sheriff Brody, he said I was confused, that it's a family matter." I looked at my hands, twisting my fingers together. "He suggested I should have a doctor look at me, my memory." Jessica finally looked up from her phone, her eyes bright with a predatory gleam she didn't bother to hide. "Oh, Melanie, we've been so worried." The lie was as transparent as the glass of iced lemon water, sweating on the coaster beside her. I paused, letting the silence stretch, making them wait for my surrender. "I think maybe you're right. About Evergreen Meadows. It might be for the best." The relief that washed over David's face was so profound, it was almost comical. He finally turned to face me, his expression a nauseating blend of pity and gratitude. "Mom, I really think it is. It's a wonderful place. They have activities, people your own age." Jessica stood up, gliding over to me. She placed a cool, manicured hand on my arm. It felt like a brand. "I'll call them tomorrow morning and set up a tour. We can all go on Friday. How does that sound?" Her voice was saccharine, the tone one uses for a difficult child or a pet that needs to be put down. "Friday," I repeated, my gaze distant, as if trying to recall what day of the week it was. "Yes, that would be fine." Her beam was incandescent, a complete, unadulterated triumph. She had won. She had disposed of the inconvenient old woman and her toxic ancestral junk. She had consolidated her control over the house, over her husband, over my life. She squeezed my arm, a gesture of finality. "It's all going to be okay now," she said, before turning back to her phone, already dismissing me. I was no longer a person. I was a problem, solved. For the next few days, I became a ghost in my own home. I perfected the role of the defeated, senile woman. My hands would tremble as I lifted my teacup, sometimes rattling it so hard against the saucer that a bit of tea would slosh over the side. Jessica would sigh with theatrical impatience. I would stare at the television for hours, my eyes unfocused, not reacting even when they changed the channel right in front of me. I would ask David the same question twice in the span of 10 minutes. Then look confused when he answered with a frustrated edge in his voice. "Did you say the bank? Oh, I thought you said something else." They began to talk around me and then through me. My presence was as noted as a floor lamp. Their conversations were a constant humming soundtrack to my silent preparations. They were consumed with the planning of a massive garden party. The caterer quoted, "How much for the salmon puffs?" Jessica would squawk into her phone, pacing the living room. "That's obscene, but I guess we have to. The Montgomerys are coming. We need more string lights for the gazebo," David would mutter,
Scrolling through a tablet. "And I need to confirm the valet service. With everyone from the Havenwood Historical Society and the Development Board coming, parking will be a nightmare." I sat in my armchair, pretending to nap, my ears drinking in every detail. The party wasn't just a party, it was a coronation. They were celebrating their latest real estate venture, a luxury housing development they had christened, with a staggering lack of irony, Thorne Legacy Estates. They were unveiling the plans at the party, a triumphant presentation to the town's elite, the very people whose families had built their fortunes on the bones of mine. They spoke of architects and zoning permits, of profit margins and marketing strategies. They were so blinded by their ambition, so cocooned in their arrogance, that they never once looked at the quiet old woman in the corner. They never saw the flicker of cold, calculating fire behind the vacant stare. They saw a relic. They had no idea they were looking at their reckoning. While my world had shrunk to the four walls of that house, a different kind of work was beginning across town, in a place that smelled of old paper, wood polish, and secrets. While I was fumbling with a fork at the dinner table, Mr. Abernathy was descending into the digital catacombs. I knew what he was doing. He had explained the mechanism to me years ago. A contingency plan my grandmother had put in place with his father, a plan so baroque, so patient, that it seemed like something from a novel. The symbol from the music box, the Ouroboros devouring a lightning bolt, was not a mere family crest. It was the final key, the master password. When scanned by a specific program on a secured, isolated computer, it granted access to a server hidden so deep in the dark web that it was a ghost in the machine, a server named simply the Callaway Archive. The true genius of my ancestors wasn't in hiding the data. It was in how they locked it. The artifacts Jessica had so contemptuously discarded were never about monetary value. They were physical cryptography keys. Each object, in its state of decay, held a unique variable. It was a brilliant, analog solution to a digital problem. I would sit by the window, watching the sunset over the trees my family had planted, and I would picture Abernathy at work. I pictured the tarnished silver locket, the one that had held a lock of my great-grandmother's hair. It wasn't the locket itself, but the specific computer-mapped pattern of its tarnish, a unique oxidation bloom over 80 years that corresponded to a 256-bit encryption key. Without that exact pattern, the file it protected was nothing but digital noise. I imagined the cracked porcelain doll, its face crazed with a fine web of lines. Abernathy would be scanning its face under a high-resolution light, the unique cartography of its fractures forming the decryption algorithm for another file. The water-stained letters from my grandfather, fighting a legal battle he was destined to lose. Jessica had called them mouldy trash. But the watermark on the paper, combined with the precise location and shape of the brown stains from a long-ago leak in the attic, formed a star chart. A star chart that, when overlaid with a specific date in the archive's logs, unlocked the journals of the judge who had been bribed to rule against him.
Each item was a key: the faded daguerreotype, the bent silver spoon, the book of pressed flowers. Each piece of junk was the one and only thing that could translate a specific file from gibberish into a legible, damning testament. The server held over a century of meticulous records, sworn affidavits smuggled out of town, secret recordings made on primitive wax cylinders, photographs of clandestine meetings, forged land deeds,
and personal letters confessing to crimes of arson, coercion, and murder.
A complete and irrefutable history of how the founding families of Havenwood had built their paradise on the Calloway family's ruin. Jessica, in her obsessive quest for minimalist aesthetics, hadn't just thrown away my memories. She had thrown away the locks to her own family's dungeon. She had left the door not just unlocked, but wide open. And now, thanks to the one piece she had overlooked, the music box, Mr. Abernathy was stepping inside. He had the master key. I knew the process would be slow. Each file had to be decrypted, verified, and cross-referenced, but it had begun. The silent digital gears of my family's vengeance were finally turning. And as I sat there feigning dementia, a cold, serene patience settled over me. The board was set. The pieces were in motion. All I had to do was wait for the checkmate. My week was a carefully orchestrated performance of decline. On Friday,
I allowed David and Jessica to chauffeur me to Evergreen Meadows. I feigned a shuffling confusion as we walked the polished hallways. I stared blankly at the cheerful activities director, who showed me the vibrant arts and crafts room and the social dining hall. It was clean, beige, and smelled of disinfectant and despair. It was a waiting room for death. "Isn't it lovely, Melanie?" Jessica chirped, her arm linked through mine. "The windows are large," I murmured, my voice intentionally vague. I let my eyes wander to a corner as if I'd seen something, then shook my head as if to clear it. David shot Jessica a look, a mixture of confirmation and pity. "See? She's really losing it." I agreed to everything. Yes, the room was nice. Yes, the garden was pretty. Yes, I would think about it very seriously. They drove me home, satisfied. They believed they had handled the situation with compassion and grace. They believed they were good people. That evening, as they celebrated with an expensive bottle of wine, I knew I needed to find one last thing. Arthur, my late husband, had been a man of quiet routines and meticulous order. His study had remained largely untouched since his death 5 years ago. It was my sanctuary, the one room Jessica hadn't dared to declutter. I told them I was looking for my old address book, a plausible excuse for an old woman wanting to reconnect with a past that was slipping away. "Don't strain yourself, Mum," David said, not looking up from his laptop, where he was reviewing the layout for the party invitations. "I can help you look tomorrow." No, I know just where it is," I said, already shuffling towards the study. The room smelled of him, of old books, pipe tobacco, and integrity. I ran my hand over the back of his worn leather chair, a pang of familiar grief echoing in my chest. But this time it was accompanied by a new, urgent purpose. I wasn't here for an address book. Mr. Abernathy's plan was legally sound. But he'd mentioned that any additional documentation of ownership, especially recent ones, would solidify our position beyond any possible dispute. I remembered Arthur occasionally mentioning a private holdings company, but I had always dismissed it as boring business talk. Now I needed to know more. I started with his main desk drawer. Neat files, insurance policies, old tax returns. Nothing.
I went through his filing cabinet, drawer by drawer. Stocks, bonds, the deed to our house, all in order, all mundane. A knot of frustration began to tighten in my stomach. Was I wrong? Had it just been a passing comment? I sat down in his chair, the leather sighing under my weight. I looked at the heavy mahogany desk, a piece he'd inherited from his own father. My fingers traced the familiar grain of the wood. My grief for him felt sharp tonight, a raw and hollow ache. He had been a good man, a kind man who had offered me stability and quiet affection after a lifetime of turmoil. Or so I had thought. My fingers brushed against a small, almost invisible seam in the decorative trim on the side of the desk pedestal. I pressed it. Nothing. I pushed it. Nothing. I slid it to the side. A faint click echoed in the silent room. A narrow panel, no wider than my hand, popped open. Inside was not a compartment, but a single leather-bound ledger. It wasn't his usual business ledger. It was smaller, more personal. My heart began to pound, a slow, heavy drum against my ribs. With trembling fingers, I lifted it out. The first page was dated a year after our wedding, nearly 40 years ago. His familiar, precise handwriting filled the page, but the words were stark, horrified. October 12th. I found it. In the county archives, researching the Thorne family plot. A reference to an old land transfer. It led me down a path I wish I had never walked. The Calloways, Melanie's family. It wasn't just bad business or legal manoeuvring. It was theft. It was violence. It was a conspiracy. The blood money that founded this town. My God, what have I married into? Not her, but this place, this history. She lives in the house of her enemies, and I, a Thorne, am now her husband. How can I ever tell her? How can I put that weight back on her? The breath left my body in a ragged gasp. I felt the blood drain from my face. He knew. The thought was a physical blow, harder and more stunning than Jessica's cruelty, than David's indifference. All these years he had known, the quiet life we had built together, my peaceful refuge from the ghosts of the past, had been a lie. A well-intentioned lie, perhaps, but a lie nonetheless. I turned the page, and the next, and the next. The truth unfolded in meticulous columns and handwritten notes. Arthur had not been idle. His discovery hadn't led to paralysis, but to penance. For decades, using a significant portion of his own fortune, he had been secretly, methodically, atoning. The ledger was a record of his secret war. Under the name of a holding company, Clear Creek Holdings, he had been buying back the Callaway land, parcel by stolen parcel. He would wait for years for a piece to come on the market, paying whatever was asked, using proxies and lawyers to ensure the Thorne name was never attached. A farm here, a tract of forest there, a downtown commercial block. It was all there, in his neat script, property IDs, purchase prices, dates. He had been reassembling my birthright, piece by agonizing piece. A note near the end, dated just 2 years before he died, broke me completely. The portfolio is nearly whole. Just the old Miller Ranch left. Once that is secured, I will dissolve Clear Creek Holdings and transfer everything into a trust in Melanie's name. On our 50th anniversary. My final gift. To give her back the ground beneath her feet. To right the wrongs my own family's silence helped perpetuate. She will finally be home. He died of a heart attack 11 months before our 50th anniversary. The process had stopped. The secret died with him. A deep, hollow sob tore itself from my chest. It wasn't a sound of simple grief, but of a profound, compounded betrayal. The grief for the man I had lost was now intertwined with the grief for the truth he had hidden,
for the final redemptive act he never got to complete. The silence I had mistaken for peace had been the sound of his solitary burden. And then I saw it. On the very last page, a recent entry made in a different hand, David's. It was a memo printed from a computer and tucked into the ledger, a proposal to dissolve Clear Creek Holdings, which he must have discovered among Arthur's assets, assuming it was just another investment vehicle, and to use its land portfolio as the foundation for a new, lucrative development. The name of the proposed development was written in bold at the top of the page: Thorn Legacy Estates. The air in my lungs turned to ice. The garden party, the celebration, the bright future Jessica and David were so eagerly planning was to be built directly on the grave of Arthur's secret atonement. They weren't just building on stolen land, they were building on my husband's soul. They were undoing for profit the one thing he had dedicated his life to making right. My tears stopped. The hollow ache in my chest solidified into something hard and cold and heavy as granite. This was no longer just about justice for the Callaways. It was no longer about punishing a narcissistic girl and her weak-willed husband. This was about defending my husband's legacy from the desecration of his own son. I closed the ledger. My hands were perfectly steady now. The facade of frailty was gone, burned away by a grief that had been forged into a cold, diamond-hard resolve. The garden party was in 2 days. Let them plan. Let them send their invitations and chill their champagne. They thought they were celebrating a new beginning. They had no idea they were planning their own funeral. The Saturday sun hung high and generous over Havenwood, the kind of perfect late summer afternoon that feels like a reward. From my window in the guest room, my gilded cage, I had a perfect view of the garden party. It wasn't my garden, of course. It was David and Jessica's. The lawn was an almost violently green carpet, manicured to within an inch of its life. White tents billowed softly in the breeze, sheltering tables laden with champagne flutes and intricate, bite-sized morsels of food I couldn't name. The sound of it all drifted up to me, the light, tinkling laughter of women in floral dresses, the deeper, self-assured chuckles of men in crisp linen shirts, the clink of glasses toasting to their own magnificent fortunes. It was the sound of Havenwood's the queen of this manicured kingdom. She held her phone up, a gleaming black mirror, reflecting her own perfect, smiling face, live streaming her triumph to the world. Her voice, saccharine and bright, cut through the ambient murmur. Oh my God, you guys, look at this turnout. We are celebrating the future of Havenwood today with the absolute best people, she chirped, panning the phone's camera across the crowd. She tagged them as she went, her manicured thumb jabbing at the screen. There's the amazing Mr. Henderson, our visionary developer, and the gorgeous councilwoman Albright looking stunning as always, and of course our very own pillar of the community, Sheriff Brody. Hi, Sheriff! Sheriff Brody, a man whose waistline had expanded in direct proportion to his authority, gave a hearty wave to the camera. His face was flushed with champagne and self-importance. They were all there, the descendants of the architects of my family's ruin, all gathered on land soaked in the blood and tears of Callaways, drinking and laughing as if they'd earned it, as if it were truly theirs. I watched them, a forgotten relic behind glass, a ghost in my own stolen history. They saw me as a doddering old woman,
a problem to be managed, a loose end to be tucked away in a home with a brochure-friendly name. They had pronounced my sentence, a merciful exile to a place where I would be quiet and out of sight. They thought they had won. They thought the story was over. From my vantage point, they looked like tiny figures in a snow globe, a perfect, self-contained world about to be shaken. Jessica continued her broadcast, her voice a grating soundtrack to their final moments of blissful ignorance. This is all about moving forward, new projects, new energy, leaving behind the dusty old things that hold us back and embracing a bright, clean, minimalist future. She was talking about my family's memories, the books, the letters, the music box. The toxic clutter she had so heroically cleansed from her perfect home, she was celebrating its disposal. I felt a cold, clean calm settle over me. It was the same stillness I felt standing beside my grandmother all those years ago. Her hand on my shoulder, a voice a low whisper against the Oregon wind, speaking not of vengeance, but of an inevitable reckoning. Wait for the sign of ultimate disrespect, she had told me. They will forget the debt. And in their forgetting, they will deliver themselves into your hands. I glanced at the simple digital clock on the bedside table. 2:58 p.m. 2 minutes. I smoothed the lap of my simple dress. Down below, a waiter refilled Jessica's champagne flute. She took a theatrical sip for her audience. "To new beginnings," she declared, and the little cluster of power brokers around her echoed the toast. The clock ticked over. 2:59. The sun still shone. The laughter still tinkled. The champagne still flowed. From my window, it was a portrait of serene, unshakable privilege. Then the clock on the mantelpiece in the hall downstairs, a heavy, ornate thing David's father had cherished, began to chime. 1, 2, 3. It was time. For a moment, nothing happened. The party continued, a perfect tableau of denial, and then it began. It wasn't a thunderclap or an earthquake. It was something far more modern, far more insidious. It was a buzz. The first was Mr. Henderson, the developer, a man whose smile never quite reached his eyes. His phone, resting on a white cloth table, vibrated with a low hum. He glanced at it, an expression of mild annoyance on his face. He picked it up. His thumb swiped across the screen. I saw his posture change. Just a subtle stiffening of the spine. He blinked. He read it again. Then another buzz. Councilwoman Albright, mid-laugh, reached into her expensive handbag. Then another. Sheriff Brody's phone, clipped to his belt, let out a sharp electronic chirp. Across the lawn, a soft symphony of notifications began to rise, a plague of electronic locusts descending upon the garden party. A confused murmur rippled through the guests, replacing the laughter. Heads lifted from conversations, brows furrowed. People were looking at their phones, then at each other, their faces painted with a shared dawning confusion. Jessica was still live streaming, oblivious. "What's going on? Is there a big news alert? Did I miss a meme?" she asked her phone, laughing it off. But the laugh was brittle. She turned to her father, a portly man with a carefully curated tan. "Dad, what is it?" He didn't answer. He was staring at his screen, his face turning a blotchy, unhealthy shade of red. "What is this, some kind of sick joke?" he muttered. An anonymous email with a deceptively simple subject line, a Havenwood founding story, had landed in the inbox of every major news outlet from Seattle to Portland. Simultaneously, a brand new Twitter account, @HavenwoodDebt, had posted its first ever tweet. It was a link to a file, and in the body of the tweet, it had methodically tagged every single person of influence at that party. I could see the screen of a young woman standing near the rose bushes. I knew what she was looking at. It was a decrypted file linked to the tarnished silver locket my grandmother had worn every day of her life. The locket Jessica had held up to her camera, calling it worthless and creepy. It was a high-resolution scan of a document yellowed with age, written in the elegant, looping cursive of the early 20th century. It was a sworn confession, dated November 1922, signed by one Alistair Finch, Jessica's great-grandfather. I knew the words by heart. I didn't need to see them on a screen. I, Alistair Finch, being of sound mind and burdened soul, do hereby confess to the orchestration of the fire at the Callaway farmstead on the night of October 14th, 1922. The land was coveted, the richest in the valley,
And the Callaway family would not sell. They were proud, stubborn.
So a solution was devised. With the aid of two men, paid in cash and whiskey, we waited for the autumn wind. We set the blaze at the barn, intending only to frighten them out, to force their hand. But the wind turned. It carried the flames to the house with a speed God himself could not have intended. I saw it from the ridge. I heard the screams. I did nothing. Sarah Callaway and her two small children, a boy and a girl, perished in the inferno. The official report would call it an accident. It was not. It was murder born of greed, and on that cursed ground, we built our future. Jessica had finally stopped her live stream. Her own phone was in her hand now. The bright, bubbly mask had fallen away, replaced by a slack-jawed disbelief. This is fake, she stammered, a voice thin and reedy. It's a deep fake or some kind of hack. It's not real. But the murmuring was growing louder, more panicked. People were pulling away from each other, forming small, anxious clusters. They were no longer party guests. They were co-conspirators, suddenly illuminated by a spotlight they never knew existed. Sheriff Brody was trying to project an air of authority, his voice booming across the lawn. "All right, everyone, settle down. It's clearly some kind of coordinated prank, a smear campaign. Don't give them the satisfaction. Everyone just put your phones away." But no one was listening. Their digital leashes were now instruments of their own unravelling. They couldn't look away. And Mr. Abernathy, my quiet, unassuming keeper of oaths, was not finished. The silence that followed Brody's failed command was thick and tense. It lasted for what felt like an eternity, but the clock on my bedside table told me it had only been 4 minutes. In that time, the entire social ecosystem of the garden party had collapsed. The air of celebration had curdled into a thick soup of fear and suspicion.
Alliances forged over golf games and charity auctions were dissolving in real time.
I watched as the developer, Mr. Henderson, took a half step away from Sheriff Brody. A subtle but unmistakable act of distancing. Then, at precisely 3:05 p.m., the second wave hit. Another cascade of notifications, more insistent this time. A new tweet from @HavenwoodDebt. A new file. This one was unlocked by the memory of a cracked porcelain doll, one whose faded, painted-on dress matched a swatch of fabric I'd kept folded in a book of poetry. A doll that had belonged to the little girl who died in the fire. This document was different. It wasn't a confession soaked in guilt. It was the cold, bureaucratic evidence of the cover-up. The first page was a scan of the official town marshal's report from 1922. The masthead read, Havenwood Municipal Authority, and the author was Marshal Franklin Brody, Sheriff Brody's grandfather. The text was stark, its lies laid bare in faded typewriter ink.
Following a thorough investigation, I could almost read the words from memory,
I've concluded that the fire at the Callaway property was the result of an accidental kitchen fire, likely caused by an unattended wood stove. No evidence of foul play has been found. A tragic accident. Jessica, desperate to find an ally, a hand to hold in her freefall, looked towards Sheriff Brody. Sheriff, tell them it's a lie. Sheriff Brody's face had gone from a healthy, champagne-fueled ruddiness to a pale, clammy grey. He was staring at his own phone, at the document that bore his family's name. Because beneath the scan of the falsified report was a second document, a scanned copy of a deed transfer dated 1 week after the fire. It showed a gift of 50 pristine acres of what was once Callaway grazing land, transferred directly from Alastair Finch to Marshall Franklin Brody for the sum of $1. The price of silence. The foundation of the Brody family's prosperity.
Sheriff? A voice called out, sharp with accusation. It was Councilwoman Albright. Her face was a mask of cold fury. Her family wasn't implicated, not yet. But she could clearly see the rot spreading, threatening to consume the entire structure they all depended on. Brody tried to speak. He opened his mouth, but only a dry, croaking sound came out. He looked like a fish gasping for air. He, the pillar of the community, the man who lectured high schoolers about law and order, was standing on a foundation of murder and bribery. He ran a hand over his face, smearing the sweat. It's a historical document, he stammered, his voice lacking any of its usual bluster. It's being taken out of context. It was a different time, and June. A different time, spat Mr. Henderson, the developer. His face was white. He was doing frantic calculations in his head. I was sure of it. Calculating how this rot might affect the permits for the new luxury condo development he was celebrating, the one being built on the very land mentioned in the deed. The panic was no longer a murmur. It was a palpable thing, a frantic, ugly energy whipping through the garden. People were making calls, their voices low and urgent. Get Richard on the line, our lawyer, now. Did you see this? Is it real? My God, the press. Jessica's world had shrunk to the glowing screen in her hand. The hundreds of thousands of followers, the brand deals, the curated perfection, it had all evaporated. She looked up from her phone, her eyes wide with a terror that was, finally, truly dawning. She looked past the panicked faces of her guests, past the immaculate lawn, and her gaze travelled up to the second-floor window where I sat. Our eyes met. For the first time, she truly saw me. Not as a piece of furniture, not as an inconvenient old woman, but as a person. And in her eyes, I saw the question, you. I gave no sign. I didn't smile, I didn't nod, I simply watched. I let her see the stillness, the quiet abyss that had opened up beneath her feet. I let her understand that this was not a random attack, this was a response, an echo of an action she herself had set in motion when she'd tossed my family's soul into a garbage can. The chaos on the lawn was reaching its peak. Arguments were breaking out, accusations were flying. The beautiful, orderly party had devolved into a scene from a disaster movie, the moment just before the building collapses. The guests, these titans of Havenwood, were trampling the perfect grass, their champagne-soaked shoes grinding mud into the green carpet. They were trapped, not by walls, but by their own shared history, now made public. They were scurrying, looking for an exit where there was none. And then, as the noise reached a crescendo, the final blow landed. It came not with a buzz, but with a silent, devastating finality. A third and final file from @Havenwood Debt. This one was not a story of a crime. There was no blood, no fire, no secret payoffs. It was worse. It was a legal document. It was a scan of the original charter for the Callaway Trust, established by my great-grandfather in 1905, before Havenwood was even a name on a map. The paper was ancient, the language formal and dense, filled with the unforgiving precision of the law. It was the foundational document of the entire valley. I watched as screens lit up with the text. I could see the confusion on their faces as they scanned the legalese, trying to understand what this had to do with the crimes of their ancestors. And then I knew the exact moment they reached the critical clause. I could see it in the way their bodies went rigid, the way the last vestiges of colour drained from their faces. The charter stated, in no uncertain terms, that the Calloway family had never sold the land to the so-called founding families. They had leased it, a 999-year lease for a nominal fee under one single unbreakable condition.
I mouthed the words as they read them on their screens. The lease of said lands is granted in perpetuity on the covenant that the history of the valley and the foundational debt owed to the Calloway family be preserved and honoured. This history is physically embodied in a specific collection of artefacts, hereafter named the Articles of Memory, to be passed down through the Calloway line. This is not a request, but a binding condition of this charter. The document went on to list the artefacts: a leather-bound journal, a silver music box, a collection of letters tied with a blue ribbon, a cracked porcelain doll, a tarnished locket, all the toxic clutter Jessica had held up for her online audience to ridicule. And then came the final paragraph, the one my grandmother had called the sleeping blade, the dormancy clause. Should an act of willful and total desecration of the Articles of Memory occur, perpetrated by a lessee or their direct descendant,
This covenant is hereby broken.
the act shall trigger this clause, rendering the foundational lease for all designated parcels of land within the Havenwood Valley null and void, effective immediately. All titles shall revert without contest to the Calloway Trust. A profound, deathly silence fell over the garden. The frantic calls stopped. The arguments died in their throats. The only sound was the gentle rustle of leaves in the trees, a sound that suddenly seemed mocking. They understood. Jessica didn't just throw out some old junk to make a TikTok video. She hadn't just disrespected an old woman. She, a direct descendant of Alistair Finch, had taken a ceremonial key and unlocked the self-destruct sequence for her entire world. The land, the house David and Jessica stood in, the manicured lawn they stood upon, Mr. Henderson's planned development, the properties owned by the descendants of every family named in the original lease, which accounted for nearly 80% of Havenwood's most valuable real estate. It was all gone. It had all reverted. The land and everything built upon it now belonged to the Calloway Trust. And as I sat there, watching the utter devastation dawn on their faces, I felt the weight of a century of silence settle around me, not as a burden, but as a mantle of power. The charter was clear on one final point. I, Melanie Calloway Thorne, was its sole living executor. From my vantage point at the dining room window, the garden party looked like a painting of paradise. Manicured emerald lawn, guests in linen and silk, the late afternoon sun turning champagne flutes into liquid gold. Jessica was the centerpiece, of course, her phone held aloft on a gimbal, narrating her perfect life to a digital audience who lapped it up like cream. She was talking about community, about the future, about the groundbreaking of a new luxury development her family was backing. A future built on the bones of my past. I felt nothing watching her. Not anger, not sadness, just a profound and heavy stillness. The calm at the eye of a hurricane I knew was about to make landfall. Then it began. Not with a thunderclap, but with a buzz. A single phone vibrating on a glass-top table. Then another. A guest One of the town councilmen furrowed his brow, his thumb scrolling. His wife leaned over, her smile faltering as she read his screen. Across the lawn, another phone lit up, and another, a digital plague spreading silently from pocket to pocket. The cheerful chatter began to fray at the edges, replaced by a low, confused murmur. I watched Jessica's father, a man whose swagger was his entire personality, clap Sheriff Brody on the back. Brody's phone buzzed insistently. He ignored it. It buzzed again. He finally glanced down, his jovial expression melting like wax.
He stared at the screen, his face slackening with disbelief.
That was the signal. That was the first crack in the dam. Abernathy was a man of his word. 3 o'clock on the dot. The murmur became a wave of whispers. I could see the words forming on their lips, even from here. Callaway. Fire. 1922. Jessica was still beaming into her phone, oblivious, talking about organic canapes. A guest stumbled backwards, knocking into a server, sending a tray of glasses shattering to the stone patio. The sharp, splintering sound cut through the air, and for a moment, everyone froze. The party was over. The wake had begun. "What is this?" someone shouted, his voice tight with panic. He was holding his phone out like a talisman against evil. "What the hell is this email?" "It's a hoax," another voice insisted, but without conviction. Then, the second wave hit. Exactly 5 minutes after the first, a new chorus of chimes and vibrations. This time, the reaction was immediate and visceral.
A woman gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Sheriff Brody's face went from pale to ashen. His grandfather. Bribery. A cover-up. The connections were being made in real time, the ugly architecture of their shared history laid bare under the bright, unforgiving sun. Jessica's father finally looked up from his own phone, his face a mask of purple fury. He lunged toward Brody, grabbing him by the lapels of his uniform. "What did your family do?" he screamed, his voice raw. "What did you let happen?" Brody, a man who commanded respect through sheer intimidation, looked small and lost. His phone was now ringing incessantly, a shrill panic shriek. I could guess who it was: the State Attorney General's office, the media. The comfortable, insulated world of Havenwood was being breached from all sides. Accusations flew like shrapnel. The man whose family owned the bank was screaming at the woman whose great-uncle had been the judge. Lifelong friends and allies were suddenly enemies. Their alliances, built on generations of shared secrets, dissolving into panicked self-preservation. It was a sinkhole of their own making, and they were all being pulled down into it. And Jessica. She finally lowered her phone, her influencer's smile frozen on her face. Her live feed was still running. Her thousands of followers were no longer watching a curated display of wealth and success. They were watching her world implode. They were watching her legacy be revealed for what it was, a crime scene. Her phone captured her face as the realization dawned, the vacant stare, the trembling lip, the silent scream that seemed to echo in the sudden, horrifying silence that fell over the garden. Her social and financial obliteration broadcast live for the world to see. I didn't need to be there to hear the sound. I could feel the vibration of the collapse in the floorboards of the house, in the very air I was breathing. The world they had built on our ashes had finally crumbled. The following Monday arrived, not with a bang, but with the sterile, quiet hum of consequence.
The house felt cavernous, stripped of its false cheer. The scent of Jessica's expensive floral diffusers couldn't mask the underlying odour of decay, of failure. They had barely spoken since the party. David moved through the rooms like a ghost, his shoulders permanently slumped.
Jessica hadn't left her bedroom. Her social media had gone dark. The silence was heavier than any argument could ever be. Around 10 in the morning, a courier on a bicycle pulled up to the curb. He wasn't the usual mailman. He carried a single, crisp legal envelope. David answered the door, his movements slow, weary. He signed for the envelope with a hand that trembled slightly and closed the door with a soft click. He stood in the foyer for a long time, just looking at the envelope. He didn't need to open it to know what it was. It was the other shoe, finally dropping. With a deep, shuddering sigh, he slid his finger under the seal and pulled out a single sheet of thick, cream-coloured paper. I watched him from the archway of the living room. His eyes scanned the page, his face already pale, draining of its remaining colour, until it was the colour of ash. He read it once, then again, as if the words might change. An eviction notice, 30 days to vacate the property. At the top of the page was not the name of a law firm or a bank. The letterhead was simple, elegant, and devastating. It read, "The Havenwood Reclamation Foundation," and at the bottom, above the typed line for the executor, was my signature. I had practiced it for a week until it was perfect. Not the shaky scrawl of an old woman, but the clear, steady, undeniable hand of a Calloway. David's hands fell to his sides, the paper fluttering from his grasp to the polished floor. He looked up and saw me standing there. His mouth opened, but no words came out. What was there to say? I had said nothing for years, and now my silence was the loudest thing in the room. He sank onto the bottom step of the grand staircase, his head in his hands. Jessica appeared at the top of the stairs, drawn by the silence. She saw the letter on the floor, saw the look on David's face, and then she looked at me. For the first time, she saw me. Not the dotty old woman. Not the burden. She saw the architect of her ruin. And she too said nothing. I turned and walked back to my room. I didn't need to gloat. I didn't need to say, "I told you so." The paper on the floor said everything. I had a small suitcase, one I'd kept since my husband was alive, tucked away in the back of my closet. I placed it on the bed and began to pack. A few changes of clothes, a photograph of my grandmother, the worn copy of a book my husband had given me. I wasn't taking anything that belonged to this house, to this life they had forced upon me. I was just taking what was mine. When I was done, I zipped the bag, walked out of the room, down the stairs and past them both. I didn't look at them. I didn't have to. I opened the front door and walked out into the afternoon light, leaving the door open behind me. I left them in the echoing silence of the house that was no longer theirs. The final scene of my old life did not take place in a lawyer's office, surrounded by deeds and titles. It wasn't in the grand house I now technically owned. It was here, in the quiet, dusty light of Mr. Abernathy's antique shop. The air smelled of old paper, beeswax and thyme. A grandfather clock in the corner ticked a slow, steady rhythm, measuring out a new era. Mr. Abernathy had worked a small miracle. He'd navigated the bureaucratic maze of the police department's evidence locker and retrieved the one piece I still needed. He placed it on the counter between us, his movements gentle, reverent. The silver music box. It looked small and unassuming, the last physical remnant of the life that was, the key that had unlocked everything. I reached out and took it. The silver was cool and heavy in my hands. It felt different now. It was no longer just a keepsake. It was a testament, a survivor. I turned it over, my thumb tracing the familiar etched patterns.
my mind a quiet, empty space. All the anger, all the years of patient waiting had drained away, leaving behind a profound calm. My fingers found the small ornate key on its side. With a steady hand, I began to wind it. The soft clicks of the mechanism were the only sounds in the shop, each one a gear turning, a lock falling into place. I stopped, holding my breath. And then it played. It wasn't a triumphant march or a sorrowful dirge. It was a melody I hadn't heard since I was a child. A soft, melancholic lullaby my grandmother used to sing to me on the porch of a farmhouse that no longer existed. The simple, gentle notes filled the dusty air, weaving a story of their own. A story of love and loss and a promise kept across a century.
It was not the sound of victory. It was not the sound of revenge. It was the sound of a long-held breath finally being released. It was the sound of a century of enforced silence finally, blessedly ending. It was the sound of a debt horrifically and completely paid.